When people hear words like crusades, empires, or holy wars, they usually imagine belief, faith, and ideology driving history forward, knights marching under crosses, kings claiming divine purpose, and belief did matter. But belief alone never built the largest empire the world had ever seen. Money did. Or more accurately, the illusion of it. Here on Finance Historian Official, we look past myths and flags and ask a harder question. What actually powers empires and what destroys them? In the 16th century, long before Britain ruled the seas, before Wall Street existed, before London became a financial center, Spain stood at the center of the world. It was the first empire in human history that could truly call itself global. Spanish kings ruled lands stretching from Europe to Africa, from the Americas to Asia. Their territories were so vast that people began to say the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire. A phrase later borrowed by others who would follow the same path. Spain did not look rich. It was rich unimaginably so. Gold and silver flowed into Spanish ports in volumes never seen before. For the first time, a single crown commanded more precious metal than entire continents had known for centuries. It looked like destiny, it looked like divine favor. And it looked unstoppable. But this is where the story turns. Because Spain did something that many societies still do today. It mistook sudden money for real wealth. And that mistake would cost it everything. After 1492, when Spanish explorers reached the Americas, they did not find empty lands. They found civilizations built on systems, labor, and resources. The conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521 handed Spain access to rich silver deposits in Mexico. A decade later, the fall of the Inca Empire unlocked the mountain of Potosi in present-day Bolivia. A mine so vast and so deadly that locals called it the mountain that eats men. For more than a century, silver poured out of the Americas like a river with no end. Treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic in long convoys, guarded by cannons and soldiers. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and over 2,000 tons of gold. That was more silver than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years combined. This treasure did not just change Spain, it reshaped the entire world. Spanish silver flowed through Seville and Cadiz into Europe, paying for wars, luxuries, and imports. It crossed the Pacific to Manila, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. This was the birth of the first global economy, and Spain sat at its center like a beating heart. To understand how dominant Spain was, consider this. When Jamestown, the first permanent English colony, was founded in 1607 as a struggling swamp settlement, Mexico City already had universities, printing presses, paved streets, and cathedrals. Lima was a thriving administrative capital. St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, became the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, decades before England gained a foothold. Spain was not behind the world. It was building the world. And yet beneath the surface something was rotting. The problem was not that Spain had too little money. The problem was that it had far too much of it, arriving far too fast and being used in all the wrong ways. As silver flooded the economy, prices began to rise. Slowly at first, then relentlessly. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Spain roughly quadrupled. Bread, clothing, rent, everything became more expensive. Ordinary people felt poorer year after year, even as ships unloaded mountains of silver into Spanish ports. This was not coincidence. It was economics. Money only holds value when it is scarce enough to be trusted. When too much enters circulation without a matching increase in real goods and production, its purchasing power collapses. Spain had silver. What it lacked was productivity. Imagine a small town where bread costs 1 coin. Then suddenly, 10 times more coins arrive, but the number of bakers and loaves stays the same. Bakers notice people have more money, so they raise prices. Soon bread costs 2 coins, then 3, then 4. Nothing about the bread changed. Only the value of the money did. That was Spain's reality. Economists later called it the price revolution, the first great wave of global inflation. Silver chased too few goods. And the consequences were brutal. Those who touched the silver first, nobles, merchants, royal officials, benefited before prices adjusted. But workers, farmers, and soldiers paid the price. Their wages stayed the same while living costs exploded. The more treasure arrived, the worse daily life became. And instead of correcting course, Spain doubled down. Rather than investing silver into local industries, manufacturing, or innovation, Spain spent it. Italian silk, Flemish textiles, German metalwork. Foreign merchants flooded Spanish markets, paid in American silver. Why build factories when treasure ships arrived every year? Why develop trade networks when mines seemed endless? Spain became a consumer empire, not a producer. Its domestic industries withered while rivals grew stronger. At the same time, Spanish monarchs burned vast fortunes on war. The Habsburg kings believed they were defenders of Catholic Europe after the Protestant Reformation. That mission came with a massive price tag: wars against the Ottoman Empire, campaigns to crush the Dutch revolt, intervention in French religious wars, and eventually, total involvement in the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. Every campaign was funded with silver from the Americas. Even the infamous Spanish Armada of 1588, sent to crush Protestant England, was paid for with New World treasure. When the Armada failed, the loss was not just military humiliation, it was financial disaster. Here is where the illusion of wealth became fatal. Spain was not just spending silver. It was borrowing against silver that had not yet arrived. German banking families like the Fuggers and later Genoese financiers loaned massive sums to the Spanish crown, secured by future treasure fleets. As long as silver kept coming, the system worked, but fleets were delayed. Ships sank. Storms destroyed convoys. Pirates struck. When silver did not arrive on time, Spain defaulted. The richest empire on earth declared bankruptcy in 1557, then again in 1575, again in 1596, and again in the early 1600s, 4 state bankruptcies in half a century. Imagine controlling half the known world and still telling creditors, "We cannot pay." And then came the men who understood exactly how fragile Spain had become. Pirates. Not criminals. Not adventurers. Weapons. England and the Dutch Republic realized that Spain's power was concentrated into a single vulnerability: the treasure fleet. Strike it, and you did not just steal gold. You shattered Spain's credit system. Francis Drake, backed by Queen Elizabeth, raided Spanish shipping throughout the Americas and the Pacific. His voyages returned with treasure worth a huge portion of England's annual revenue. Dutch privateers did the same. In 1628, Piet Ing captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba, worth over 11 million guilders. That single event nearly collapsed Spanish finances overnight. Spain had mortgaged tomorrow's silver. When pirates claimed it today, the future disappeared. And while Spain struggled, its enemies reinvested. Stolen silver funded navies, banks, trade companies. The foundations of modern capitalism were being built using Spain's own lifeblood. By the early 1600s, Spain still looked powerful on maps. Its empire stretched across oceans, its kings lived in palaces. Its churches glittered with gold. But the empire was hollow. Inflation crushed the poor. Debt shackled the crown. Pirates drained the treasury. Industries at home were weak. And the silver that once made Spain unstoppable had become the very thing destroying it. And this is where part 1 ends. Because the most important question still remains. If Spain had more money than any empire before it, why did others rise while it fell? Here on Finance Historian Official, we will see how Britain and the Dutch learned from Spain's mistakes, how systems defeated treasure, and why this story is not just history. It is a warning. As Spain staggered under the weight of its own treasure, the rest of Europe was paying very close attention. Not to Spain's victories, but to its failures. Empires rarely fall in silence. They fall in public, and the smart ones learn by watching. Here on Finance Historian Official, this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Spain did not collapse because it lacked resources. It collapsed because it misunderstood what resources are supposed to do. By the early 1600s, Spain still controlled enormous territory. Its flag flew over vast parts of the Americas, much of Italy, the Philippines, and strategic ports across Europe. On paper, no power could rival it. But power on paper does not pay soldiers, feed citizens, or sustain credit. Systems do. Spain's empire was built on extraction. Mines, tribute, forced labor, and treasure fleets. Colonies existed to send wealth home, not to become strong economies themselves. Once silver left the ground, Spain believed the job was done. What happened next barely mattered. That mindset shaped everything. Agriculture at home was neglected. Manufacturing was weak. Trade networks were underdeveloped. Spain imported what it consumed and paid for it with bullion. It lived off the past instead of building the future. Meanwhile, its rivals were building something very different. The Dutch Republic did not have mountains of silver. What it had was ships, merchants, and financial discipline. Amsterdam became a hub of trade not because of treasure, but because of trust. The Dutch created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, developed advanced accounting, and built a navy designed not just for war but for commerce. Wealth circulated, capital was reinvested. Risk was spread. England followed a similar path. It did not strike gold in North America. What it found instead were resources that could be produced again and again. Tobacco, sugar, timber, later cotton. These were not one-time windfalls. They were renewable engines of growth. Instead of treasure fleets, England built institutions, the Bank of England, a national debt system that investors trusted. Chartered companies like the East India Company, which turned trade into a machine that generated returns year after year. Money was not just spent, it was put to work. This was the difference that Spain never grasped. Spain measured wealth by what it owned. Its rivals measured wealth by what their systems could produce tomorrow. As silver continued to flood Spain, inflation never truly stopped. Wages lagged behind prices. Taxes climbed. The crown squeezed peasants and merchants harder to pay interest on loans to foreign bankers. Productive citizens paid for an empire that no longer worked for them. Trust eroded. And once trust disappears, economies unravel fast. The repeated bankruptcies of the Spanish crown poisoned its reputation. Creditors demanded higher interest. Loans became harder to secure. Every delay in a treasure fleet sent shockwaves through European markets. Spain lived from shipment to shipment, crisis to crisis. And then came the wars that finally broke its spine. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, consumed unimaginable resources. Spanish silver poured into battlefields across Europe. Soldiers died, cities burned. And the returns were nothing but debt and exhaustion. Spain fought not to gain wealth, but to defend prestige and ideology. Those are the most expensive wars of all. While Spain bled, the Dutch secured independence and expanded trade. England refined its naval power and financial institutions. France modernized its state and taxation. Spain was surrounded by rivals who were learning faster than it was adapting. By the mid-1600s, the decline was impossible to hide. The Spanish Navy was no longer dominant. Its army struggled to maintain control over distant territories. Inflation had hollowed out domestic prosperity. And the silver that once seemed infinite began to slow. The mines of Potosi did not last forever. Extraction became harder. Output declined. The conveyor belt of treasure that Spain depended on started to weaken. And because Spain had failed to build productive alternatives, there was nothing to replace it. This is the moment when illusion finally shattered. An empire built on treasure cannot survive when treasure fades. An empire built on systems can. Spain still had land. It still had history. But it no longer had momentum. The world had moved on. By the 1700s, Britain had become the dominant naval and financial power. The Dutch had proven that a small nation with strong institutions could outperform massive empires. Spain became a cautionary tale rather than a model. And this is where the story stops being about the past. Because the mistake Spain made is not unique, it is timeless. Whenever societies experience sudden inflows of money, from resources, credit, or financial expansion, the temptation is always the same. Spend now, borrow more. Assume the flow will never stop. Treat money as wealth instead of asking what actually produces value. Spain believed silver guaranteed power. Today, governments believe liquidity guarantees stability. Corporations believe cheap credit guarantees growth. Individuals believe rising asset prices guarantee security. The mechanisms change. The psychology does not. Inflation is not just an economic phenomenon. It is a social one. It transfers wealth quietly. Those closest to new money benefit first. Those living on wages fall behind. The gap widens. Frustration grows. Trust weakens. Spain's peasants watched silver ships arrive while bread prices doubled. Today, workers watch markets rise while their purchasing power shrinks. Different century. Same rhythm. Spain's treasure fleets were vulnerable because they concentrated enormous wealth into single shipments. One storm, One pirate attack, one disaster. Today's financial systems concentrate risk in institutions deemed too big to fail. When one collapses, the shock spreads everywhere. Pirating's capture of the treasure fleet in 1628 was not just theft. It exposed how fragile Spain's entire system had become. Modern financial crises do the same thing. They reveal weaknesses that were hidden by easy money. And just like Spain, the response is often more borrowing, more spending, more denial. The lesson Spain teaches is not that wealth is bad. It is that wealth without structure is dangerous. Money without productivity corrodes. Power without discipline collapses. Real wealth is built slowly. Through institutions that endure, through systems that produce value repeatedly, through trust that compounds over time. Spain had the world in its hands and let it slip through its fingers because it chased appearance over foundation. Its rivals inherited the future because they understood the deeper game. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes often enough that ignoring it is a choice. Here on Finance Historian Official, this is why we study the past. Not to admire empires, but to understand the forces that shape our own world. Spain's fall was not inevitable. It was engineered by decisions that felt logical at the time. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because every era believes it is different. Every generation believes it is smarter. And every system built on the illusion of endless money eventually meets reality. The question is not whether the warning signs are there. The question is whether we recognize them before the treasure runs out. If this story changed how you see wealth, power, or money, subscribe to Finance Historian Official. History has already lived through our future.